The plane touched down just after sunset, when Dubai glowed like a constellation spilled across the desert. From the window, Keanu Reeves watched the city shimmer, its towers catching the last orange threads of daylight before surrendering to neon and gold. He had traveled the world more times than he could count, yet Dubai always felt different, almost unreal, as if it had been imagined first and then built without compromise. Tonight, however, the beauty barely registered. Exhaustion clung to him like a heavy coat. The drive from the airport was smooth and silent. A black luxury SUV carried him along immaculate highways, past illuminated skyscrapers and fountains that seemed to rise in choreographed defiance of gravity. His driver spoke little, offering polite nods and professional restraint. Keanu appreciated the quiet. The past few weeks had been relentless, long shoots, interviews, flights stacked upon flights. This film summit in Dubai was meant to be a brief appearance, a courtesy to international partners, nothing more. 2 nights, a panel discussion, a few photographs, and then home. The hotel emerged like a palace, its entrance framed by soft golden lights and tall palms, swaying gently in the warm night air. As the SUV stopped, attendants moved with rehearsed precision. Doors opened. Luggage disappeared into waiting hands. Keanu stepped out, his boots touching polished stone, and for a moment he felt the familiar sensation of being observed, recognized, measured. Cameras were absent, but eyes were everywhere. Inside, the lobby was vast and immaculate. Marble floors reflected crystal chandeliers overhead, multiplying their glow until the entire space seemed to breathe light. The air was cool and faintly scented, a contrast to the heat outside. Guests moved through the lobby in elegant currents, businessmen in tailored suits, families dressed for luxury, influencers gliding with phones discreetly angled. Keanu adjusted his jacket, suddenly aware of how tired, with careful respect. Yet each step took longer than expected. A minor issue appeared in the booking. Nothing serious, the receptionist assured him, just a detail to clarify. Keanu nodded, waiting, fingers tapping lightly against the counter. Minutes passed. Jet lag pressed harder. The noise of the lobby, once distant and soft, grew sharper. Laughter echoed. Shoes clicked against marble. Somewhere, a phone rang. Keanu exhaled slowly, reminding himself where he was. Reminding himself that patience was part of travel, part of life. Still, a quiet tension began to coil beneath his calm exterior. This hotel, this city, demanded composure, demanded respect. He knew that. Everyone did. As he stood beneath the chandeliers, surrounded by luxury and expectation, Keanu had no idea that this small delay, this seemingly insignificant moment at the reception desk, was the first step toward a night that would challenge his self-control and reshape the way the world saw him at least for a while. The receptionist finally looked up from the screen, her polite smile still in place but now edged with uncertainty. She explained that the system showed a discrepancy between the reserved suite and the one currently available. It was a simple issue, she said, something that would be resolved shortly. Keanu nodded again, though the words barely registered. Fatigue dulled his ability to filter emotion, and irritation crept closer to the surface. A manager approached, his posture formal, his tone measured and calm. He spoke carefully, choosing words that balanced hospitality with procedure. In Dubai, rules mattered. Respect mattered. Keanu understood this intellectually, yet in that moment, standing beneath the brilliant chandeliers with eyes subtly tracking his every movement, he felt cornered by small inconveniences that suddenly seemed much larger than they were. "Isn't this already confirmed?" Keanu asked, his voice low but tight. It wasn't an accusation, not yet, but the tension was unmistakable. The manager assured him again that everything would be handled promptly and invited him to take a seat in the lounge. The suggestion, though courteous, landed poorly. Keanu had been sitting for nearly 16 hours already. The idea of waiting longer tested the thin line of patience he had left. As the conversation continued, words began to sharpen. His responses grew shorter, more clipped. A hint of sarcasm slipped through, unintended but unmistakable. The receptionist stiffened slightly, maintaining her professionalism, while the manager's expression shifted from neutral to concerned. Nearby guests slowed their steps, sensing friction, curiosity pulling their attention toward the desk. Keanu felt it then, the subtle shift in atmosphere. "This shouldn't be complicated," the words echoed more than expected in the fatigue, the pressure, the unrelenting attention, all of it collided at once. A remark slipped out, edged with bitterness. A sentence he would later replay in his mind again and again. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't obscene. But it was dismissive, cutting enough to draw a visible reaction from those around him. A few guests exchanged glances. Someone looked away. Someone else subtly raised a phone, though no recording began yet. Almost immediately, Keanu realized the shift. He saw it in the receptionist's eyes, in the manager's tightened jaw. Regret arrived quickly, but pride and frustration held him in place. He said nothing more, turning his gaze toward the towering windows instead, watching the city lights pulse beyond the glass. The issue was resolved moments later. Keys were presented. Apologies were exchanged. On the surface, everything returned to order, but the damage was already done. As Keanu walked toward the elevators, the polished calm of the hotel closing behind him, he carried with him the uneasy knowledge that a single tense exchange had planted a seed, one that would not remain contained within the marble walls of the lobby. The private lounge was meant to be a refuge. Soft lighting, low music, and deep leather chairs created an atmosphere designed to calm even the most restless minds. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed Dubai's skyline in full nocturnal glory, towers glowing like polished steel against the dark sky. Keanu entered the space hoping the quiet would settle his nerves, that a drink and a few minutes of solitude would reset the tone of the night. He chose a seat near the window, setting his jacket beside him. A server approached, offering water and a menu. Keanu nodded in thanks, forcing a small smile. For a while, he simply watched the city below, traffic flowing like threads of light, reminding himself how small this moment really was. He had handled worse days, heavier pressures. This should have been easy to shake off. Not far away, a small group occupied another corner of the lounge. Their voices were low but animated, laughter punctuating their conversation. At first, Keanu paid them no attention. Then his name surfaced, drifting across the room like an unintended echo. He didn't look over immediately, hoping he had misheard. But it came again, followed by a dismissive chuckle. "He's not what he used to be," someone said. Another voice replied, casual and careless. "Overrated. Just lucky rolls and a quiet personality people mistake for depth." The words landed harder than they should have. Keanu felt his jaw tighten. He had endured criticism his entire career, but hearing it spoken so freely, so close, while his patience was already frayed, struck a nerve. He turned toward the group. They noticed him then, expressions shifting from amusement to surprise. A brief, awkward pause followed, the kind that invites retreat. Instead, one of them smirked as if daring him to respond. Keanu stood, slowly, deliberately, carrying the weight of years spent navigating fame. "I can hear you," he said evenly. The calm in his voice contrasted sharply with the intensity in his eyes. The group exchanged glances, one person muttering a half-hearted apology, another, emboldened perhaps by alcohol or arrogance, shrugged and said, "Just opinions. Comes with the job, right?" Attention. Conversations around the lounge quieted. Heads turned. When he finally stopped, silence filled the space. The group looked stunned, offended, embarrassed. One person stood abruptly and walked away. Another reached for a phone, hesitating, then slipping it back into a pocket. Keanu exhaled, the adrenaline draining as quickly as it had surged. He sat back down, hands clasped tightly, staring at his reflection in the dark glass of the window. The man looking back at him seemed unfamiliar, tenser, harder, less forgiving. Around him, the lounge slowly returned to its murmur, but the atmosphere had changed. The refuge he sought had become another stage, and the consequences of his words were already beginning to move beyond his control. The silence that followed did not last long, but its echo lingered, Conversations in the lounge resumed cautiously. Voices lowered, laughter restrained. People pretended to return to their drinks, their phones, their private worlds. Yet the energy of the room had unmistakably shifted. Something had happened, something worth remembering, and everyone knew it. Keanu remained seated, staring out at the city as if the glass could absorb his thoughts. He felt eyes on him, not opally, but in quick glances and reflections caught in polished surfaces. Fame had taught him to sense attention the way others sensed weather. Tonight, the air was charged. He could almost feel the story forming, word by word, in the minds of strangers. At a nearby table, two guests leaned toward each other, whispering behind raised glasses. One of them discreetly typed a message on their phone, pausing to look up, then continuing. Across the room, a well-dressed influencer subtly angled her camera, snapping a photo of the skyline that just happened to include Keanu's silhouette in the corner. It looked harmless. It never was. Hotel staff moved with increased alertness. A supervisor spoke quietly into an earpiece. The server, who had frozen earlier, now avoided the area altogether. Nothing dramatic occurred, no confrontation, no raised voices. Yet the incident had become communal property, shared in fragments and interpretations. Each witness carried away a slightly different version of events. He snapped, one guest murmured. He was provoked, another insisted. I heard he insulted them badly, someone else added. Their certainty growing with distance from the truth. Keanu stood at last, leaving his untouched drink behind. As he walked toward the exit of the lounge, conversations dipped again, like waves pulling back from shore. He kept his posture composed, his expression neutral, but inside, unease grew. He had felt this before, that moment when control slips not through action, but through perception. In the hallway outside, the lighting was brighter, cooler. A pair of guests passed him, smiling politely, then exchanging looks once they thought he was out of sight. One of them whispered his name, not unkindly, but with the curiosity reserved for scandal. Keanu pressed the elevator button and waited, the soft chime echoing louder than it should have. Stories were being shaped. Somewhere, someone would exaggerate his words. Up in his suite, Keanu set his phone on the table and watched. It light up with notifications. He did not open. He knew the pattern too well. What felt contained never stayed that way. A private lapse, witnessed by a few, could ripple outward with astonishing speed. Outside, Dubai continued its nightly brilliance, unaware and unmoved. Inside the hotel, behind closed doors and glowing screens, the incident grew legs. By morning, it would no longer belong to him alone. The whispers had already begun their journey, and there was no calling them back. Morning arrived quietly, filtered through sheer curtains and the pale gold of the rising sun. Keanu woke with the dull weight of unrest pressing behind his eyes. For a few seconds, he lay still, suspended between sleep and memory. Then the night returned in fragments, the lounge, the voices, the sharpness of his own words. Regret settled in, slow and heavy. A knock at the door broke the silence. It was polite, measured, unmistakably formal. Keanu pulled on a shirt and opened the door to find a senior hotel representative standing with another manager from the previous night. Their expressions were calm, respectful, but serious. This was not a courtesy visit. They spoke inside the suite, choosing their words with care. The incident, they explained, had been reported internally. No complaints had been formally filed, but concerns had been raised. In Dubai, they reminded him gently, public conduct carried weight beyond personal intention. Words spoken in frustration could be interpreted as disrespect, especially within spaces governed by strict cultural and social expectations. Keanu listened without interruption. He felt the difference immediately. This was not about celebrity misbehavior or public image alone. This was about place, context, responsibility. He had crossed an invisible line he had not fully seen at the time. The manager explained further, not accusatory but firm. Dubai welcomed the world, but it expected visitors to honor its standards. Private spaces were not lawless zones of expression. Respect was not optional, and influence amplified accountability. Keanu nodded slowly, absorbing each sentence. The weight of his status, something he often tried to ignore, pressed down harder than usual. When they left, the suite felt larger, emptier. Keanu moved to the window and looked out over the city in daylight. The skyline was just as stunning, but different now, sharper, more real. He thought about how easily familiarity bred carelessness. He had traveled so widely that hotels blurred together. Cultures sometimes reduced to schedules and contracts. Last night had been a reminder that none of that was interchangeable. His phone buzzed again. This time, he checked it. Messages from his team had begun to arrive. "Are you okay? I won red." Another was more direct. "There's talk." Small, but growing. No headlines yet. No videos circulating widely. But the ground was shifting. Keanu sat on the edge of the bed, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. He replayed the moment in the lounge, not two. By the time he stood again, his decision was forming. He could retreat into silence. Let his team manage the situation, let time smooth it over. Or he could face it directly. On terms that respected the culture he was a guest within. Outside, the call to prayer drifted faintly across the city, steady and grounding. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment and breathed. The night before had drawn a line. What mattered now was how he chose to step back from it. By midday, the quiet containment of the incident had begun to fracture. It started subtly, almost politely, the way modern storms always do. A message forwarded twice too many times. A caption phrased as a question rather than an accusation. A grainy clip posted briefly, then deleted, but not before it was saved elsewhere. Keanu's team arrived at the hotel in staggered intervals. Their presence calm but purposeful. Phones vibrated constantly. Laptops opened on polished tables. Screens filled with headlines that were not yet headlines. Just whispers gathering shape. Unconfirmed report. Sources. Say witnesses. Claim. Each phrase carried the potential to harden into something far less forgiving. The video was short, no more than 15 seconds. Shot from a distance, partially obscured by a glass panel. It showed Keanu standing in the lounge, posture tense. His voice indistinct but clearly raised. Context was absent. Provocation invisible. What remained was impression, and impression was enough. Online, speculation rushed to fill the gaps. Some defended him immediately, citing his long-standing reputation for humility and kindness. Others seized the moment, reframing it as proof that public personas were illusions. Comment sections divided into familiar camps, certainty growing louder with every repost. The truth, nuanced and inconvenient, struggled to keep pace. International outlets began making inquiries. Not formal yet, but close. A journalist emailed his publicist requesting a brief. Comment. Another asked whether Keanu would still appear at the film's summit panel scheduled for the next evening. The implication was clear. Silence would be interpreted as avoidance. Keanu watched this unfold from a distance, seated quietly as his team discussed strategy. He felt strangely detached, as though the man in the video was a version of himself slightly out of sync with reality. He recognized the posture, the tension in the shoulders, but not the intent others were projecting onto it. "What do you want to do?" his publicist asked gently, breaking the rhythm of professional analysis. Keanu did not answer immediately. He thought of the lounge, of the words he had chosen poorly, of the cultural line he had crossed without fully seeing it. He thought of how quickly a single moment could be reduced to a symbol, stripped of intention and complexity. Still watching, the summit organizers sent a formal message expressing hope for clarity and reassurance, polite, concerned, carefully neutral. Keanu finally stood and walked toward the window. The city spread beneath him in sharp daylight. He exhaled, long and steady. "I don't want this managed like damage control," he said at last. "I want it handled like responsibility." The room fell quiet. His team exchanged glances, recognizing the shift. The story was no longer just about an incident in a hotel lounge. It was about how a public figure chose to respond when the spotlight turned unforgiving. The afternoon stretched on in uneasy quiet. Meetings ended, phones were silenced. and for the first time since the incident began to ripple outward, Keanu was alone. The suite felt different now, less like a sanctuary, and more like a holding space between who he had been the night before and who he needed to be next. He sat at the small desk near the window, the city spread wide beneath him. In daylight, Dubai looked precise and intentional, every road and tower placed with confidence. It made him think about control, about how carefully constructed things could still be, and undone by a single miscalculation. He had always believed words mattered. That belief had guided his career, his interviews, the way he navigated fame with restraint. And yet, in one tired, defensive moment, he had betrayed that principle. Keanu closed his eyes and replayed the scene again, slower this time. The overheard remarks, the tightening in his chest, the choice to stand rather than let it pass. He recognized the trigger now, not just the insult, but the deeper frustration behind it. Years of being spoken about rather than spoken to. Years of assumptions, projections, and simplified narratives. He had told himself he was at peace with it. Last night proved that peace was not permanent. What unsettled him most was not the criticism online or the looming headlines. It was the realization that he had caused discomfort in a place that had offered him nothing but hospitality. Intent did not erase impact. He had crossed a cultural boundary, not out of malice but out of self-absorption. That truth was harder to confront than any public backlash. He stood and walked slowly through the suite, touching familiar objects, the back of a chair, the edge of the bed, the cool glass of the window. Movement helped him think. Fame had taught him how quickly people filled silence with conclusions, but it had also taught him that authenticity, when practiced carefully, could still cut through noise. Keanu thought about the younger version of himself, the one who had struggled to find footing in an industry that rewarded confidence even when it was hollow. He had promised himself back then that if he ever gained a voice people listened to, he would use it thoughtfully. That promise had not been broken entirely, but it had been bent. The question was not whether he could explain himself. He could. Context existed. Provocation existed. He returned to the desk and picked up his phone, not to scroll, not to monitor reactions, but to draft a message in his own words, simple, direct, honest, an acknowledgement of fault without theatrics, an expression of respect for a culture he had momentarily failed to honor. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, indifferent yet present. Inside the suite, a decision had been made. The noise would come. The judgment would follow. But when Keanu stepped forward again, it would not be from defensiveness or fear. The meeting was arranged quietly, without announcements or intermediaries. Late afternoon light softened the edges of the hotel's executive conference room, where the city skyline framed the windows like a distant audience. Keanu arrived early, standing rather than sitting, hands loosely folded in front of him. He wanted to meet this moment awake, present, without the shield of comfort. One by one, the doors opened. The senior hotel representative entered first, followed by the lounge supervisor and the staff members who had been closest to the incident. Their expressions were composed, professional, cautious. This was not a confrontation fueled by anger. It was something more restrained and therefore more difficult. Keanu spoke first. He did not wait for formalities to settle in. "I want to apologize," he said simply. There was no preface, no explanation attached. He looked at each person as he spoke, not scanning the room, not performing. "What I said last night was disrespectful. Regardless of how I felt in that moment, my words crossed a line. I was a guest here, and I failed to act like one." The room remained quiet. The hotel representative inclined his head slightly, signaling acknowledgement, but did not interrupt. Keanu continued, his voice steady but unguarded. "I understand that in this city, respect is not just personal, it's cultural. I didn't honor that. I'm sorry for the discomfort I caused, and for putting any of you in a difficult position." One of the staff members shifted, visibly surprised. This was not the kind of apology they were accustomed to hearing from someone of his stature. Another nodded faintly, tension easing just a fraction. Keanu for addressing the matter directly and acknowledged the sincerity of his words. He explained again the importance of maintaining decorum, not as a rule to enforce, but as a shared responsibility. Keanu listened without interruption, accepting correction without defensiveness. There were no demands made, no penalties imposed. That alone spoke volumes. The meeting was not about punishment. It was about recognition. Before leaving, Keanu addressed the staff once more. "I appreciate the way this was handled," he said, "and I appreciate being given the chance to make this right." As the doors closed behind him, he exhaled deeply. The weight he had been carrying since the night before lifted. Not entirely, but enough to let him breathe freely again. The situation was not erased. The media would still speculate. Opinions would still form. But the most important audience had been present, and he had spoken honestly to them. Walking back through the hotel corridor, Keanu felt something unfamiliar but welcome: resolution. Not the kind that comes from escaping consequences, but the kind that comes from facing them squarely. Whatever followed next, he knew he had met this moment the right way. And for the first time since his arrival in Dubai, the city felt less like a test and more like a teach. The statement was released just before evening, timed carefully but written without polish. Keanu insisted on that. No dramatic phrasing, no strategic ambiguity. The message appeared across official channels at once plain and unmistakably human. He acknowledged the incident directly. He did not dispute that his words had been inappropriate. He did not shift focus to provocation or exhaustion. Instead, he emphasized responsibility, respect, and the importance of honoring cultural norms when traveling as a guest. Within minutes, the response surged. News outlets updated their articles, adding his words beneath headlines that now softened in tone. Commentators paused, recalibrating. Some praised the clarity of the apology. Others remained skeptical, dissecting intention and timing. The internet rarely agreed on anything, and this was no exception. Keanu watched none of it in real time. He handed his phone to his publicist and stepped away, retreating to the quiet of the suite once more. He had said what needed to be said. The rest was no longer his to manage. That evening, the film summit organizers confirmed his appearance would proceed as scheduled. The message was brief, professional, supportive. It carried an unspoken acknowledgement that the situation had been addressed with maturity. As dusk settled, Keanu prepared for the panel. The mirror reflected a familiar figure, calm on the surface, contemplative beneath. He adjusted his jacket, not as armor but as readiness. The city beyond the window lit up once more, vibrant and indifferent, yet somehow more forgiving than it had felt the night before. At the summit, applause greeted him when he stepped on stage. Not thunderous, not diminished, simply present. He spoke about film, about collaboration across cultures, about listening as much as speaking. No reference was made to the incident, but the subtext lingered. His words carried extra weight now, shaped by experience rather than image. Later, alone again, Keanu allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection. Public perception would continue to shift as it always did. Some would forget, some would remember. That was beyond his control. What remained within his control was the way he moved forward. The way he chose restraint over reaction, awareness over assumption. Outside, the night air hummed with life. Inside, the noise had faded. The story was no longer spiraling. It was settling, reshaping itself around accountability rather than outrage. And in that space, imperfect but honest, Keanu found something resembling peace. The morning of departure arrived without ceremony. No cameras waited in the lobby. No crowds gathered at the entrance. Dubai woke as it always did, efficient and luminous, indifferent to the small human dramas that had briefly unfolded within its walls. For Keanu, that quiet felt earned. He packed slowly, folding clothes with care, moving without the restlessness that had followed him since his arrival. The suite, once a place of tension and introspection, now felt neutral again. Just a room, just a stop along the way. He paused at the window one last time, watching sunlight strike the glass towers, turning them into mirrors of the sky. Downstairs, the hotel staff greeted him with the same professionalism as before. Polite nods, courteous smiles. Nothing lingered in their expressions, and he was grateful for that. At the desk, the checkout was swift, efficient, almost deliberately ordinary. Before leaving, Keanu offered a quiet thank you, sincere and unforced. It was met with a respectful nod. Outside, his car waited. As he stepped into the warm air, he felt the familiar sensation of transition, the space between one place and the next. Dubai had not been unkind to him. It had simply required awareness and, in doing so, reminded him of something he already knew but had momentarily forgotten. The drive to the airport passed in reflective silence. Skyscrapers gave way to open roads. The city receded not as a spectacle, but as an experience that would remain with him long after the headlines faded. He did not check his phone. He did not need to. At the terminal, he moved through security unnoticed. Just another traveler among thousands. The anonymity felt grounding. When the plane lifted off, Keanu watched the city shrink beneath the wings, its lights dissolving into patterns, then into memory. He did not think of the incident as a failure, nor did he frame it as a lesson learned for public relations. It was simply a moment of being human under pressure, followed by a choice to respond with humility. As the clouds closed in, the world below disappeared entirely. Ahead lay new destinations, new conversations, new chances to listen more carefully than he spoke. The story would remain behind, settled into its final shape, and as Keanu leaned back in his seat, eyes closed, he carried with him not the weight of controversy, but the quiet understanding that growth rarely announces itself loudly.